Okay, the topic that I'm going to discuss right now is William Henry Scott from the perspective of anthropologists. So I was not really introduced as to who I am. So I am a professor of anthropology at the Department of Anthropology of UP Diliman. I am also currently the president of the International Council of Museums. So the topic that was assigned to me is Scott from the perspective of anthropologists in the plural. Unfortunately, due to the lockdowns, I was not able to communicate with many of my colleagues. And so many of these recollections are based on my personal interaction and my knowledge of Scott's publications. So first, on a personal note, I first met William Henry Scott when I was a freshman in UP. So I was the vice president of the Anthropology Society of UP during that time. And I was introduced to Scott by Father Manuel Lajos at St. Andrew's Seminary. And we were introduced as both members of a support group of the Cordillera. And informally, we were called the Friends of the Igorots, or FI. Of course, that was a very short meeting, but through that meeting, I got to know Scott. And of course, later on, I've read his works, including The Discovery of the Igrots, one of the books that inspired me to focus my research in the Cordillera. So, although I don't come from Baguio or the Cordillera, most of my researches have been on the Cordillera. So, uh, Scott is, of course, a well known historian, but many people call him as an anthropologist, and this is something that he was not comfortable with. He would reject that idea. But of course, there is an interface between anthropology and history. So anthropologists, just like historians, are very much interested in history. So we would refer to the anthropological approach as historical, comparative, and cross-cultural. However, the anthropologist's interests in human history begins when humans first evolved in Africa. So it's a longer period of time. And traditionally, historians were more preoccupied in studying the historical period. Of course, the time when there was already written records, relying mainly on archival sources, while anthropologists were more interested in the prehistoric period, using data from archaeology, folklore, and historical linguistics. Of course, this divide now between these two disciplines is no longer true. There are many anthropologists who are historical anthropologists as well, studying the historical period. And there will be historians that look into prehistory and use methods of anthropology, such as studying oral history. And of course, when we talk about prehistory, again, traditionally, that was the domain of anthropologists. Let us just look at the works of the father of modern Philippine anthropology, Dr. H. Otley Beyer. So some of his works on Philippine prehistory were, among others, arrangement of data in history and ethnography of the Ifugao people, which were a series of publications made during the time of 1910 to 1912. The Philippines before Magellan, published in 1921. The Philippine Saga, something that Scott later wrote about, uh, a pictorial history of the archipelago since time began, published in the Philippine magazine in 1947. Philippine and East Asian archaeology and its relation to the origin of the Pacific Islands population, published in 1948. And The Origin and History of the Rice Terraces, published in 1955. So Dr. Beyer pioneered in the study of Philippine prehistory using mainly archaeological data. Of course, he would have many other archaeological publications, but not necessarily related to reconstructing prehistory. Beyer was followed by other anthropologists in their interest in studying Philippine prehistory. For example, Fred Egan of the University of Chicago on his Visayan accounts of early Bornean settlements in the Philippines, published in 1956. Felix Keesing on the ethnohistory of Northern Luzon, published in 1962. Aram Yengoyam's The Initial Populating of the Philippines, Some Problems and Interpretations, published in 1967. Dr. Jess Peralta and Lucila Salazar's Pre-Spanish Manila, a reconstruction of the prehistory of Manila. Dr. F. Landa Hocano's Philippine Prehistory, published in 1975. And again, Hocano's Filipino Prehistory, Rediscovering Pre-Colonial Heritage. So, again, this domain that the study of prehistory belongs to anthropology and not to history was something that many historians respected. But for William Henry Scott, he verged into this area of research. Let me first cite Scott's review of Kissing's Ethnohistory of Northern Luzon, published in the American Anthropologist issue of 1963. So this is a book review of Kissing's work. According to Scott, in that review, so these are his closing remarks on his review. Finally, since so much argument hinges on so few references, meaning references cited by Kissing, it is a pity that the author relied so heavily upon the Blair and Robertson translations, and peculiar that he quotes so frequently from Isabelo de los Reyes, a folklorist and polemicist of the revolutionary period, with no more insight into the pre-Spanish Philippines than Kissing's own. It is to be hoped that other scholars will follow Kissing's lead and make the same use of documents not available to him at Stanford, where Kissing was based, especially the Dominican records in the University of Santo Tomas, Manila, and the Augustinian archives in Valladolid. So this book review was published in the American Anthropologist, a reputable journal uh, of, of anthropology in the world. So even if he was not an anthropologist himself, he was recognized by anthropologists as an expert in the field that he was studying. So these are some of the works of Scott on Philippine prehistory and protohistory. Of course, there will be more, but these are some of them that particularly got the attention of Filipino anthropologists. First is Prehispanic source materials for the study of Philippine history, published in 1968. This is a product of his PhD dissertation in UST. Later, I'll talk about it more. Another publication will be The Discovery of the Igorots, published in 1974. The Prehispanic source materials was republished in 1984 in a revised edition, this time with certain uh, insights into anthropology's role in prehistory. Looking for the Prehispanic Filipino, published in 1992, and of course, Barangay 16th Century Philippine Culture and Society, published in 1994. I won't talk about the last one because one of the speakers today will focus on this topic. So, William Henry Scott was very much interested in prehistory, more particularly on pre-Hispanic Philippine society and culture. And this was why some people regarded Scott as, quote, an anthropologist, although Scott himself rejected this label. So Scott did not really have a degree in anthropology, but he was recognized informally by many anthropologists and the public in general as an anthropologist because of his works in prehistory, in ethnohistory, in ethnology. Um, so Scott engaged with anthropologists. As I mentioned, uh, the book review of Keesing's magnum opus on Northern Luzon was done by Scott himself. Uh, Scott's pre-Hispanic source materials for the study of Philippine prehistory devoted 2 chapters on non-written sources. First, on archaeology. Of course, during that time, it was only through anthropology that archaeology was done in the Philippines, and linguistics, more particularly historical linguistics. Of course, in the chapter on linguistics, he also talked about paleography, although technically that is already written record. So these are the same sources that anthropologists generally use when they do research on prehistory and or ethnohistory. So this time, Scott was treading into an area that was traditionally defined as an area reserved for anthropologists. But this should not be the case, of course. We really encourage more historians to do research on prehistory. So, in Scott's preface on his revised edition on Philippine prehistoric sources, so pre-Hispanic sources, so he mentioned about Beyer. So let me quote. So he was referring here to historians in general who wrote sections about prehistory in their textbooks. So while none of these historians had done original research on the pre-Hispanic period himself, they gave specific or general references to the authorities on whom their statements were based, except in the case of the late Dr. H. Otley Beyer, whose findings and opinions were usually introduced and often disguised by such phrases as "it is believed that." Okay, so it was some sort of a criticism of Beyer because it is like a scientific guess. interpreting based on archaeological records what these artifacts mean. Of course, Beyer wrote about the 10 Bornean Datus in his The Philippine Saga. And this is a page from the Philippine Saga. Beyer used the story of the 10 Bornean Datus as proof of his fury on the waves of migration. These are my words. Beyer used folkloric and pseudo-historical evidences, such as the Maragtas Code, to back up the story of the 10 Bornean Datus as facts. And this is something that, again, Scott critiqued later on. So here are some passages from Scott's review on the Maragtas in his 1984 publication. So he said, Beyer had an English translation of the Maragtas made by 4 of his anthropology students in 1916. And of course, he also mentioned Beyer had this startling and unsupported statement in 1949, that was the Philippine Saga, that the Maragtas was a pre-Hispanic document. And of course, in this work on pre-Hispanic source materials, Scott debunked the Maragtas as a at least based on the written accounts, that it was a pre-Hispanic document. So he continued to criticize not just Beyer, but also those who echoed Beyer, such as other anthropologists, such as Tom Harrison and other ethnologists. So he said, this myth, provided by Beyer, was given wider circulation by another anthropologist, the late Tom Harrison, editor of the Sarawak Museum Journal, by publishing the Carrion translation in 1957, with an introduction which persists in referring to the Monte Claro translation, or the Monte Claro work, not as the author of the Maragtas, but as a mere redactor or transcriber of some ancient Philippine legend. And Scott goes back to the Monte Claro document, where Monte Claro himself admitted that he is the writer of this document and he is trying to recall what he has heard or what he has learned. So basically, they were indeed folkloric materials, but they have been written down by Monte Claro. Okay. Furthermore, Scott mentioned this Carrion translation, in turn, has been given word by word attention by other ethnologists, although he did not mention who these ethnologists were, seeking clues to such Philippine details as specific crops or agricultural techniques during the pre-Hispanic period. Okay, so another thing, of course, these other ethnologists would say that, yes, in these translations by Carrion, there would be Spanish words such as Dios, for example, but maybe they were added later. But basically, the original document was from a pre-Hispanic period, something that Scott was not comfortable with. For him, there should be documentary evidence to show that such data is indeed derived from a pre-Hispanic material. Another thing that Scott criticized was Otley Beyer's Waves of Migration Theory. Before showing to you Scott's critique of this theory, let me remind the viewers right now what this theory is about. So this theory, again, first published in the Philippine Saga in 1949, says that there were a series of 5 migrations of different peoples coming into the Philippines. So the ancestors of various ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines came from one or several of these uh, ancestors coming in different waves. So according to Beyer, the first wave were those of humans similar to the Java man. And of course, we know that the Java man is Homo erectus, about 230,000 years before present. And they reached the Philippines through land bridges during the Pleistocene epoch. The second wave were Australoid Negrito people and Australoid Sakai peoples reaching the Philippines through land bridges 25,000 to 30,000 years ago. And these were the ancestors of the Negritos, of the various Negrito peoples of the Philippines, such as the Aita, the Agta, the Dumaguete, the Ati, Mamanwa, etc. The third wave were those of early Neolithic people, or what Beyer called as Indonesian A, coming from southern China and reaching the Philippines through boats, no longer land bridges, about 5,000 to 6,000 years before present. The next fourth wave were the Indonesian B people coming from the coast of Vietnam and South China, reaching the Philippines in 1500 BC. And the final wave are the Malay people or the Iron Age folk from the coast of Indochina and South China between 800 and 500 BC, bringing with them a bronze culture. And the Malay people were the ancestors, are the ancestors of many lowland Filipinos, such as the Tagalogs, Visayans, Ilocanos, Kapampangans, etc. For a very long period of time, this theory was propagated in our educational system. And of course, it was criticized both by anthropologists as well as historians such as William Henry Scott. The sixth wave, I forgot, will be the Orang Dampuans or the men of Champa, of course, in central Vietnam, coming from Annam between 900 and 1200 AD. Of course, we know that the people of the Cham people of central Vietnam are also Austronesian speaking peoples and very much related to Majapahit in Sumatra. Of course, so this is Scott's critique of Bayer's wave of migration theory. In his book, he just calls them Beyer wave migration theory. So according to Scott, since Bayer's day, 40 years of additional research have cast doubt on this synthesis, the theory. Geologists question the existence of land bridges. Archaeologists cannot fit lithic finds into his categories. Anthropologists demand skeletal remains to determine human stature. Prehistorians are persuaded of the antiquity of trade contacts in Southeast Asia. And linguists believe that people speaking Philippine languages were living in the archipelago thousands of years ago. Probably none of them would accept Bayer's assumption that by examining living populations, you can determine what kind of tools their ancestors used, or that by examining tools, you can determine the race of men who made them. Scott even went on to give a parallelism. For example, if you find someone eating McDonald's hamburger in Manila, does this mean that Tagalogs own McDonald's even in the past? So Scott disputed evidences or the lack thereof coming from Bayer's theory. Beyer also gave little consideration to the fact that cultures are dynamic, not static, that they survive through change, adjustment, innovation, development, and borrowing. It is probably safe to say that no anthropologist now accepts the Beyer wave migration theory today. So this quotation where Scott talks about how cultures are dynamic, not static, that they are in constant change, sounds as if an anthropologist is writing it, critiquing an earlier anthropologist. Aside from prehistory, Scott made significant contributions as well in terms of ethnohistorical research. Again, a domain that was previously in the realm of anthropologists, but definitely ethnohistory is a field where there is common interest by both anthropologists and historians. So Scott's The Discovery of the Igorots, Spanish Contacts with the Pagans of Northern Luzon, is an important contribution in the history of Cordillera, especially Cordillera ethnohistory. So going back to the book review of Scott, of Keesing's work, where he encourages historians to do more research in archives that were not available to Keesing. Practically, this is what Scott did. And this is why he studied in UST, did research in UST, and did archival research about Philippine prehistory, or at least Philippine history during the time of Spanish contact. Another challenge that Scott did for to anthropologists was to look back at your data, reflect on your sources, look into what is acceptable and what is not in reconstructing ethnohistory. Of course, many anthropologists use the ethnographic present when they write about ethnohistory. In some cases, this is possible. For example, you do present research among the Agta of Palanan Isabela in order to understand how it was in the past. Because basically, the Agta of Palanan Isabela are still, many of them are still nomadic hunters and gatherers. In some cases, you can do that. But in other cases, actually in most cases, the ethnographic present is very much different from the conditions and the context of the past. And this is something that we should be on guard about. So what anthropologists do right now, for example, in doing ethnoarchaeology, uh, ethnoarchaeologists study particular cultures, but comparing it to another culture that will have more or less the same cultural setting. Not necessarily the same culture area, but the same context. So Scott studied and interrogated existing ethnographies about the Igorots. This is in his book on the discovery of the Igorots. He went back to Father Francisco Antolin's 1795 ethnography and to Dr. Hans Beyer and Dr. Alexander Schadenberg's ethnography of 1898. Interestingly, that book on the discovery of the Igorots, the foreword was written by Dr. Harold Conklin, chair of the Department of Anthropology of Yale University, which just proves that Scott was indeed recognized by many anthropologists, uh, many of them from outside the Philippines, but are recognized people by anthropologists in the Philippines. So here are my concluding remarks on Scott's contributions. Scott engaged with anthropologists such as Keesing and Beyer by reviewing and critiquing their works. Scott incorporated data derived from anthropological research, especially in the fields of archaeology and historical linguistics, in his study of Philippine prehistory. Scott's major contributions to Philippine anthropology are in the fields of Philippine prehistory and Cordillera ethnohistory. So while William Henry Scott himself may not be comfortable with considering himself as an anthropologist, I recognize William Henry Scott as an anthropologist and in making significant contributions in Philippine anthropology. Thank you very much.